This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 477, entitled The Ideological Clash between the MGTOWs and the Masculists. Description. This flyer discusses the great differences and the similarities, as well as the intellectual debts that the Masculists have towards the MGTOWs. Many MGTOWs see the Masculists as just another version of the MRM, that's men's rights movement. But that is an error. Masculists are hugely more aggressive, verbally violent and radical than the MRM, who are out to destroy monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs, and to force young women to fip up, to vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws, to reform the divorce courts, to legislate the that's paternity, rejection, right, to create feminist-masculist gender equality committees in the parliaments, etc., or be severely punished by men by not getting one. Masculists are out to fundamentally change society by forcing women to grow up, to fip up, or to rot on the shelf, manless, sexless, loveless, babyless, and spat at. Now the flyer itself in 3 parts. The ideological clash between the MGTOWs and the Masculists, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Recently, I've become conscious of the video hosting site called MGTOW.tv, which, as its name suggests, is devoted to MGTOW content creators, over 600 of them, which for me offers a great targeted audience for my masculist videos. So I've been uploading hundreds of mine to it lately, and am starting to get some decent feedback from some of the MGTOWs who have watched some of them. One comment in particular, which I cut and paste below, caught my attention due to its intelligence and articulation. It expresses a view that many MGTOWs have of masculism, which as a masculist I feel is wrong-headed and ill-informed. So I use it as an Aunt Sally to be shot down with masculist arguments for the consideration of my MGTOW readers, hoping that these arguments will convert some MGTOW readers to adopt a more radical, more militant, that is, masculist viewpoint in gender politics. Here is the MGTOW comment that I was referring to above. It was written by someone who uses the pseudonym gauge theory, so is probably a physicist, in brackets, so is probably pretty smart. I would know, since I'm one myself and a mathematician. Wink. Quote, MRAs have been fighting in the courts for decades, and yet the courts are as gynocentric as ever. Your, in quotes, masculism is a version of MRA. Your FIPS shows you want equality just like the MRAs. Equality between men and women is a constructed illusion pushed by people who don't understand nature. The value of MGTOW is that it teaches men to put their own interests first, instead of being slaves to a gynocentric society that hates them. This psychology is a seed for a renewed patriarchal system, one more in accordance with nature, I respect your opinions and see that you are well-intentioned, but you are decades behind in your thinking. Best regards. That's the end quote. I will deconstruct this critique piece by piece, since I suspect a lot of other MGTOWs will essentially agree with a lot of what it says. Quote, MRAs had been fighting in the courts for decades, and yet the courts are as gynocentric as ever. End quote. This is true. In fact, one of my Masculist flyers, brackets videos, number 229, was entitled, quote, "Why is the US men's rights movement," that's MRM, "so impotent?" Question mark. My answer then was that it was not aggressive enough, not hateful enough, not confrontational enough with monoconscious feminazi bigotry. Masculism obviously has a lot in common with the MRM, as it also does with MGTOW, in brackets. Of course, there are considerable overlapping points between these three main branches of the men's lib movement: MRM, MGTOW, Masculism, close brackets. Yes, both the MRM and Masculism aim to change the gender laws. For example, the Masculists want the gender laws to be menfaired. For example, the divorce courts need fundamental reform. The that's paternity rejection right, needs to be legislated. Gender equality committees, consisting half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that both sexes' gender issues are addressed equally, which is far from being the case today. Close brackets. Masculists feel that the MRM has taken a too piecemeal approach, concentrating only on changes to the gender laws, which in a gynocentric zeitgeist that does not listen to the MRMers, which means that the MRMers, or MRAs, are fighting an uphill battle. Masculists, on the other hand, take a much more fundamental approach, aiming to socially re-engineer women so that women FIP up, that is, become FIPs, that is, financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, so that women are FIPs as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life, a major and hated gender crime by fluffies as seen by Masculists. In brackets, a fluffy is a traditional woman who does expect to parasite off the labour and money of a man. Masculists see fluffies as vermin, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out. Close brackets. Masculists are full of hatred at what the fluffy feminists have done to men in the divorce courts, financially crucifying and destroying the lives of, in capital letters, one father in four, stripping custody of his kids from him with a 90% probability, taking his house from him so his fluffy ex-wife can raise her kids in it, taking half his wealth and half of his stuff from him and giving it to her, forcing him to pay her child support for his kids he will barely see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat, parasitic ass and FIP up, so that she can continue to parasite off his money after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Masculists are abolitionists. They see their core idea being that fluffydom is manslavery, and that manslavery is slavery, and hence something to be hated and wiped out. Masculists see manslavery as a hugely greater problem than the Negro slavery of the 1800s in the US, in brackets, which was the root cause of the US Civil War. Masculists argue that men gave women science-based medicine, the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century, so have to fib up or be severely punished by men by not getting one. Masculists place enormous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and fib up. A young woman who gets the reputation of being a fluffy in her social circle will get the kiss of death from her male classmates in terms of her ever getting a man. Masculists aim to put a masculist group in every high school, every campus, so that young men are in a position to apply powerful moral pressure on young women to fib up or be manless, pariahed, cast out, rejected both socially and sexually. As masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet, as they are now doing, young men will see her as a fluffy and hence as a future manslaver, so will shun her, treat her as a social and sexual pariah, spitting in her face as a vile, manslaving, bloody fluffy. Masculists are the male equivalent of the radical feminists of the late 1800s, who decided that the traditional approach to feminism, that is using reason and quiet protest, did not work, and did not work for half a century. So Mrs. Pankhurst and her daughters in the UK decided to adopt a more radical, more violent approach, expressed in the form of their suffragette slogan, "Deeds, not words." They then got a ton of publicity that helped women get the vote in the early 1900s. Masculists see the MGTOWs as apolitical wimps. As Marx said, quote, "The philosophers have merely interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." End quote. A masculist paraphrasing of this in modern terms would give something like, quote, "The MGTOWs have merely analysed the gynocentric world in various ways. The point, however, is to masculist it." End quote. The masculists are out to fundamentally change society by wiping out the fluffy, manslaving parasites and the fluffy feminist hypocritical genociders, in brackets, who are hypocrites in the sense that they want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally with men the burden of earning the living by not fipping up. So behave as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffies in the divorce courts, thus making divorce so toxic for men that in many countries now 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity, since these young men absolutely refuse to face a 1 in 4 chance of losing their kids and be financially crucified by the hated fluffy feminist dominated divorce court system. So decide to live the MGTOW lifestyle, that is, rejecting marriage, rejecting paternity, and spending their money on themselves, thus directly wiping out whole populations, but are, in fact, merely reacting to the awful toxicity of the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts, who are then the indirect genociders, wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped with bullets, if necessary, in a sex war in which responsible males, masculist soldiers, assassinate the gender politicians who made these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place. For example, in the divorce courts that are so toxic for males, who gave women the MARA, that's in brackets, maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, but who did not give men the male equivalent, that is the PARA, in brackets equals paternity rejection right. So that women have the legal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't. So millions of men are forced to pay for a kid he never wanted, thus manslaving him for decades of his life, a major gender crime against men committed by women. Masculists are very conscious that women's gender oppression of men is hugely larger than vice versa. Even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is small beer, as seen by the Masculists, since women's gender crimes against men are often continuous and last decades. For example, the decades-lasting financial parasitism of fluffies, manslaving men for decades of their lives at a scale hugely greater than the slavers of Negroes in the southern states of the US in the 1800s. The Masculists point out that there are literally billions, with a B, of manslaves in the world today. One of the major aims of the Masculists is to wipe out manslavery worldwide this century by wiping out the fluffies and the fluffy feminists. To wipe out the fluffies, Masculists and MGTOWs merely totally ignore them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing their fluffy parasite genes to be removed from the gene pool, forcing these women to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by Masculists and MGTOWs, who in time will be most men, the way in Denmark today most women are feminists, who have set up Danish politics to suit the desires of the feminists. Masculists have a real hatred of fluffies for the same kind of reason that the abolitionists of the northern states of the US had against the owners of Negro slaves in the southern states of the US, an issue that became so heated and so violent that it eventually led to the US Civil